Welcome to Shopper Matters, a podcast brought to you by the Independent Grocers Alliance. And now your host, Michael Kier.
Hey there, you're listening to Shopper Matters, the podcast that explores the fast-paced omni-channel world of retail and uncovers insights about consumer and shopper behavior that brands need to know to connect more effectively in today's world. Shopper Matters brings you insights, industry leaders, actionable advice, and the latest thinking on what drives today's shoppers. Our podcast highlights the challenges brands face and the opportunities that come from really understanding how people live, shop, and make decisions. I'm Michael Kier, the Vice President of Brand Development at the Independent Grocers Alliance, and your host. IGA is the world's largest global grocery network with well over 7,500 retail stores in 30 countries, commonwealths, and territories. Here in the United States, we have over 2,200 rooftops. Before we introduce our guests today, we want to invite you to consider following us on your preferred podcast listening app, if you're not already doing so, of course. Subscribing, whether it's Amazon, Apple, Spotify, or other platforms, will ensure that you automatically receive new episodes as we release them. Today, we're diving into one of the fastest growing and most fascinating categories at retail, alcohol-adjacent beverages. Some call it the mocktails market, which is valued at over $8 billion in 2024 and expected to grow by about 5.7% in 2025. What started as a wellness trend has become a full-blown movement. Shoppers, especially younger ones, are drinking alcohol less, but still want that ritual, the flavor, the experience of a great adult beverage. To help us decode what's driving this shift and what it means for the shelf, we're joined by Nick Lenzi at Lipari Foods. Nick brings a distributor's eye view to what's working at retail, what shoppers are responding to, and where this space is headed next. So Nick, welcome to Shopper Matters. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and your role at Lipari Foods?
Thank you, Michael. As you stated, my name is Nick Lenzi. I'm the Senior Vice President of Marketing at Lipari. Prior to joining Lipari, my previous 42 years, I spent at retail. And so I have a very different perspective on things from a distributor's point of view, and always kind of looking at the trends and what's next and what's going to help drive the business at retail. And as you stated in the introduction, this particular category is not only one of the fastest growing categories at retail, it's also one of our fastest growing categories from a distributor's perspective as well.
Great. So let's get started at a really high level. Can you define what we mean when we talk about alcohol adjacent?
Sure. So from our perspective, alcohol is a very mature category. It's gone through changes over the years. Craft beer was popular several years ago. Things shifted into different malt beverage options and things like that. And at that point, the category became a little bit stagnant. COVID comes along and there's a big shift in the way people consume alcohol. And at that point, around 2022, you started to see this significant growth in non-alcoholic beverage options, not only in the beer, wine, and liquor space, but also changes in things like water and pop as well, where you would see beverages that had functional properties, whether they were prebiotic or probiotic, whether they had other health benefits. And so as we look at this category as a whole, it not only encompasses non-alcoholic drinks, it also encompasses things like craft soda, functional beverages, and kombuchas as well.
Gotcha. So it's not just the alcohol replacements, but alcohol, non-alcoholic drinks, more functional beverages as well. But focusing in on kind of that alcohol adjacent or mocktails. I mean, it's interesting to see just that, huge growth at retail. We went out to dinner last night and they gave us the menu of alcohol drinks, and there was, an accompanying page of mocktails that were no less interesting and delicious sounding and, romanced as the alcohol drinks. So it's interesting. So are we looking, do you think, at a generational shift, a health trend, or something bigger?
So I think it's all of the above. If you look at Nielsen, has done they've done a lot of research in this space, and what they will tell you is there are multiple reasons why you see the growth in this category. A lot of them started with COVID. If you kind of go back and you look at what happened during COVID, there were changes in the way that people gathered socially, right? They were no longer able to go out and meet in person. So there was this huge growth of online social spaces. And so that decreased the amount of alcohol that may have been consumed on an on-site premise type location. You've got people concerned about health and wellness that you spoke to. And the other thing is that all the data out there will tell you that Gen Z is the least consuming alcohol generation in history. The numbers will kind of tell you that somewhere between 20 and 35% of the Gen Z population does not consume alcohol at all. Yet, to your point, they still want to be able to have a unique drink offering and maybe even something with the flavor profile of an alcoholic drink without any of the consequences of the alcohol, if you will.
Yeah. So when you look at that shopper behavior in this alcohol adjacent category, what stands out to you the most? You talked a little bit about Gen Z, but are there other things that are standing out to you?
So I think a couple things. Number one, I think there's, for years that non-alcoholic segment had a stigma, in the public eye, right? That the quality wasn't saying the quality was lower, the flavor profile wasn't quite right. And I think a lot of those things have changed. From a retailer's perspective, if I was back in retail today, Michael, I would have a very substantial dedicated set to this category that would not only encompass non-alcoholic beers, it would also include the canned ready-to-drink non-alcoholic mocktails, as well as non-alcoholic wine and non-alcoholic spirits. I think to be successful in this, you have to have a destination department, something that will draw people in and allow you to tell a story as a retailer about the category and why people would be interested in it.
Yeah, so we're probably getting a little ahead of ourselves in terms of what should retailers do. But since you mentioned it, do you see that, or is the recommendation to have that alcohol adjacent to alcohol, or in a different part of the store as a different destination?
That's what I think a lot of people struggle with today. I would have it adjacent to the alcohol. That's where we see some of the more successful sets in the retail space today. But I think a lot of people struggle with that. Some people think that maybe this belongs with the pop or the colas, and other people think that it should be in a completely separate section all by itself. And so just from a distributor's perspective and where we've seen it successful at retail, it is in a space adjacent to the alcohol sets in the store.
Okay, that makes sense. And it's always helpful, and there's always different points of view. But given your expertise in this category, I didn't want to skip ahead without asking that question.
Absolutely.
So when we were talking prior to the podcast, you brought up this term, sober curious. Can you talk a little bit, as we're talking about what shoppers want today? Can you expand a little bit on what that moniker means to you and what those implications are?
Sure. So sober curious kind of started as a dry January trend, right? That's kind of where that name evolved from. And since then, it has grown. It's expanded beyond just non-alcoholic beer, non-alcoholic wine, and non-alcoholic spirits to also include things like the functional beverages, mushroom elixirs, craft sodas, kombuchas, hydrogen-infused waters. There is if you go to a show like Expo West or Expo East, you will see the depth and breadth of what's going on in this category today. And it certainly is a unique opportunity from a retailer's perspective. Where I came from before joining Lipari, we were very engaged in this space, and we were driving 25% of our beverage sales through what we would call alcohol adjacent, sober curious type products. So there is a demand out there for it. And fortunately at this point, not a lot of people do it well. And so you can absolutely put a stake in the ground today and own that category at retail.
Okay. Well, we'll talk a little bit about what retailers should do on the back end of the conversation. But in terms of the notion of sober curious, you talked a little bit about Gen Z. Obviously, there's a variety of different generations that are happening. Are there notable differences in terms of how various shopper segments approach the category?
Yeah. So we already kind of talked about Gen Z as the lowest alcohol consuming generation as measured. The millennials are a little more apt to try an alcoholic drink, but they are also significantly lower. And then when you look at the boomers, they will also play in the non-alcoholic space, if you will, for a variety of reasons. Whether I enjoy the taste of a beer and want to have one in the middle of the day without consuming the alcohol, what the numbers will tell you is that the older the generation, 82% of that population will buy both. They are not only buying alcoholic beverages, they will also buy a non-alcoholic beverage. So the category plays across multiple age groups, if you will. And so it's a larger market than just looking at the younger generations.
And I think that's an interesting insight to say that, there's that Venn diagram where people are doing both as opposed to one or the other. So you can't just say Nick's only alcohol and Michael's non-alcohol and vice versa. You gotta meet the shopper where they are.
Yes.
And make sure that you're meeting their needs and have that variety. So what you said, the recommendation of alcohol and alcohol adjacent together makes a lot of sense, because you may go back and forth based on what the occasion is or when you're buying.
Yeah. And to be honest, there's not, like you mentioned, you went to the restaurant and they handed you a mocktail menu. There's no social stigma around drinking a non-alcoholic drink anymore, where 10 or 15 years ago, there may have been. Number one, it probably wasn't even offered. And if you did ask for it, there may have been a stigma around it. That's not the case today. And then the other thing that you mentioned, which I think is really important to talk about too, is variety. And, where do you see the growth in these categories today? Because there are certain categories within the NA space that are growing much faster than others.
So then let's dive deeper into that. Which categories, staying within sort of the, I guess, alcohol replacement, which categories are growing faster than others, and where should retailers and viewers keep their eyes out?
Sure. So all of the big players today, most of them have a non-alcoholic option, whether it's Budweiser, Peroni, Corona, all of the big name brands have a non-alcoholic option, and those are growing significantly. The non-alcoholic options that play in the craft space, and by that I mean when you think stouts, when you think hazies, and when you think IPAs, those are growing in the triple digits year over year. 500 to 1,000% year over year. So it's great to have the standards, the industry standards, if you will, but to really appeal to the broad, the different tastes that the public has today, I think it's super important to play in that craft beer non-alcoholic space as well. The other thing that's growing significantly in that space are the canned ready to drink mocktails. A couple of the big brands there are called Clever and Mingle, and both of those have a variety of different items, really refreshing, something you could drink during the middle of the day and not going to have the consequences of drinking alcohol, if you will. And those have been really, really successful.
It sounds like going back to the beer alcohol adjacent category. Mm-hmm. Say that 5 times real fast.
Right.
That'll be complicated. It sounds like that notion of sober curious is definitely manifesting itself in terms of curiosity, right? I don't want the replacement. I want to, try different things. I want to, as you said, move into the stouts or some other stuff. So that curiosity seems to continue, not just into alcohol to non-alcohol, but even within the category.
Yes, 100%. Yep. And so there are other things out there that are a little unique as well. There's a brand called Laziza, and it is a non-alcoholic malt beverage. It's from Lebanon. But what's unique about that, it is non-fermented. And so it has the flavor profile of a beer because the components that make it are the same as a beer, but because it's non-fermented, you get the zero alcohol. So you have the taste of the beer with none of the alcohol. And so there's a lot of different ways that people go about coming up with a non-alcoholic drink. A lot of the non-alcoholic wines are actually produced with alcohol, and then they remove the alcohol after the fact. And biggest brand in the U.S. today is probably Free, F-R-E. And if you're going to have a non-alcoholic dedicated space in your store, there are a handful of wines that stand out in that category that are very well known that I think you would want to have as options for your customers.
So it's a place to dive into. You've mentioned a couple of brands along the way. Spontaneously, what brands are catching your eye in the space and why?
Yeah, so Athletic is probably the most well-known and number one non-alcoholic beer in the U.S. They're, I think, the 13th largest brewery in the U.S. today, and so you can see the growth, and they play in that craft beer space as well. So they will not only have your daily your pilsners and your lagers and things, but they will also have some of the craft things. Sober Curious plays in that craft beer non-alcoholic, or Sober Carpenter, plays in that non-alcoholic craft beer space. And then one of the fastest growing ones is called Best Day Brewing. And again, these are dedicated non-alcoholic breweries that are completely devoted to that NA space. And so that's what they specialize in. That's their claim to fame. And on the beer side, those are three brands that you would probably want to look at. And then on the mocktail side, you've got Clever, you've got Mingle, and there are others as well. But those are two that you see a lot of. They have a lot of placement around the country and are probably better well known. Free is a very strong non-alcoholic wine brand. And then there are numerous liquors. The liquor and the wine space is growing high percentages year over year, but small base. And so those are more emerging categories, if you will, not nearly as developed as the beer side.
So you talked about size of category. We talked about the upfront, the size of the alcohol adjacent or mocktail market. How does that compare, putting you on the spot, right? How does that compare to the total beer category for, near beer? It's growing like weeds, like to your point, but still a rather small percentage of the total, correct?
It is, and I don't have the percentage at my fingertips. I just know from a distributor's perspective, and as you look at it from a syndicated data perspective, the growth is there from both the transactional side at retail and the distribution side, and it's been growing. The year-over-year CAGR for the last several years has been significant. And at Lipari, it's one of our fastest growing categories.
Okay. So let's talk about, we talked about brand innovation. Let's talk about brands for a second. You mentioned some, but how important is that storytelling piece, right? Talked about athletic brand, right? Just that name has some connotations to it. So how important is the storytelling piece in helping these brands succeed with shoppers and at retail?
Especially in an unknown category like this, it's absolutely critical because to most people, it's going to be a new category that they haven't experienced before. They're going to have a lot of questions. It's not unlike specialty cheese or seafood. People are willing to try it, but not quite sure how to prepare it or how to serve it. You got this emerging category that's new. And the more that we can educate people about the flavor profile, what do I serve this with, a history of the company or the story itself, the more interesting it becomes. And a similar example, and I'll use a retailer that carried a lot of supplement type items. Supplements are one of those things that are very expensive. They're generally not familiar. They might want to try it, but don't know enough about it. This particular retailer had QR codes built around these different products so that a customer could come up, scan the code, and here is everything you ever wanted to know about this particular product on your phone. The store experience was that the items that had that information available outsold the ones that didn't 3-1. And so if I was back at retail, I would take that same philosophy and I would apply it to this category. So what can I share? How can I share it in a meaningful way with our customers so that they can learn about this product, learn about the company, the flavor profile, what makes it unique and different? I think it's critical because when you're going to try and create a destination department like this from scratch in a category that's relatively new, the better whether it's video content, whether it's QR codes, signage, whatever it might be, the more that we can market that and educate the consumer, the more successful it would be.
Yeah, that's great. So that's some good advice around retail execution. Let's continue down that path for a minute. As you mentioned, right, there's a ton of brands in this space. I think the supplement example is a great one in terms of just, I'm interested in better health, or I'm interested in, sober curious. I go to the shelf, whether it's a 2-foot shelf, a 4-foot shelf, a 16-foot shelf. It can be very overwhelming in terms of variety. Other tips or suggestions for how retailers should approach the category, especially ones perhaps who haven't gotten in it?
Sure. So from our perspective, if we're going to help a retailer get into this space, number one, if we've got it available, and if we don't, chances are we go get it, we will share transactional data, whether that is through one of the big data providers, whether it's through a reputable source, some of the trade industries, but you're going to want to know what's going on from a transactional perspective, much like people use Spins or Nielsen, right? Which ones are growing year over year, who's got the largest, penetration in the marketplace. And then the other thing that that we share as well is information from the distributor's perspective. So of the brands that, in our case, that we carry, here's what we see doing well so that we can curate an assortment that has the best chance of success. And I think that's really important, that as you look at building out this space in this category, that you have both of those available at your fingertips to make the best assortment decisions.
Right. So if I can summarize, right, regardless of Lipari Foods or other distributors, wholesalers, et cetera, really understanding that local market is critically important, and understanding the category is critically important, and matching those two together to make sure that your retail execution is going to be as pristine as possible to get things started.
Yes, 100%. It's one thing to look at the category as a whole from 5,000 feet and see that it's growing exponentially X% year over year. It's another thing then to drill it down to a state level. What's even more meaningful then is to drill it down to the local level, like you just said, because of it could be a demographic thing, it could be a localized flavor profile, whatever it might be. We try and drill it down to the least, the smallest common denominator, so that we can help someone put together the best set.
And I think the benefit, especially for IGA retailers, locally owned and operated, that they usually have their finger on the pulse of the local market.
Yes.
That said, understanding who's coming in the door isn't necessarily understanding this category. So combining what you know about the shopper with what you know about the category as granularly as possible is important. So great advice there, Nick. Thank you.
Yeah.
So given the newness of the category, and it's not so new, but for some it is, what are the biggest watch outs in this category that you see from your seat?
Sure. So number one, we kind of touched on it earlier. I think there are questions around where does it live in the store? Does it sit next to my alcohol department? Is it down my pop aisle? Is it somewhere else in the store? And so I think there's a challenge. And as you look at the growth of the category, and especially if you're able to carry all 3 or 4 beers, mocktails, wine, and liquor, where does that space come from, in your sets, if you will? Secondly, at least at a high level, some of these products are more expensive than conventional alcoholic options. These companies, they don't have the same economies of scale yet because it isn't as developed. And so there are pricing concerns to take a look at. So if depending on where you are, you may want to be cognizant of how much do I want to put in this particular space just because it's a more expensive, and will my customers pay for that? So I think that's a concern. And then the other thing is, I think we have to educate the consumer that this isn't what it was 10 years ago. And so aggressive sampling programs, whether we're running them in the ad, whether we're putting digital coupons on these things, I think you have to get trial here so people understand that it's not what it was in the past, because it's evolved significantly.
So it sounds like there's definitely people who have adopted the category, kind of rushed into the category, but to your suggestion, bringing other people into the category and making it more approachable, as you said, easy to understand through QR codes or other means of communicating the brands, making it welcoming, it sounds like.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. 100%. Yeah. And you know what? They're typically, a lot of these are fun categories as well, especially when you look at some of the other curious categories, and you can talk about some of the soda categories, craft soda, things that were popular when we were kids are all the rage now. And so retro sodas is a huge category. Sodas that are made with better for you sweeteners, whether that's honey, whether it's stevia, or whatever it might be, that's very relevant today, as well as things that have probiotics, prebiotics, cognitive awareness benefits, whatever it might be. So it's a fun category to play in, and you see a lot of trial in there as people are, they're interested in what the health claims are of some of these new sodas.
Yeah, I think to some extent it goes back to that storytelling and that curiosity that we talked about from a shopper standpoint that, spills over into a ton of different categories. And, that's one of the fun parts about going into a grocery store, shopping physically, is the exploration, the finding new things, whether that's, craft beer, whether that's cheeses, whether that's new fruits and vegetables. That exploratory piece is always interesting.
Yes.
So, Nick, this has been a really fascinating and interesting conversation. To wrap things up, is there anything we haven't covered that you think would be helpful for our retail or brand listeners to capitalize on the sober curious trend in the alcohol adjacent category?
I think the one thing I would say is to bring awareness to it at retail is probably the most important thing. Too many times you will see products brought into a store and placed on the shelf, and we hope they sell. With a brand new category like this, where there's not a lot of awareness and people haven't had a chance to try it yet, we really have to bring awareness to it through all the things we just talked about, whether we put video content on our blog sites or on our websites to, educate people about what's new in the store, whether it's through trial, whether it's through in-store marketing. You've kind of got to create that destination within the store, so that people, number one, know you have it, and number two, let's educate them about why it's unique and different, and why they should try it. And I think if you can execute those successfully, that's how you win.
Yeah, I think, clearly we'll assume the right assortment, the right merchandising, but you gotta, not just put it up, as you said, and pray that people find it. You've got to make sure that you put as much effort into it as you do other categories, and not just expect that since it's blowing up that, people will find it, people will understand it. You might attract the people that are already buying it, as we said, but not new people into the category. Right. So there's always opportunities. And the fact, having worked in beverage myself, it's a very expandable category. Mm-hmm. So, if you get people interested in beverages, right, you can drink beverages all day long. It makes a lot of sense. Right. So a huge thank you to Nick Lenzi, Senior Vice President of Marketing at Lipari Foods, for sharing his insights with us today. You definitely want to keep an eye on where the Sober Curious movement is headed next. If you're thinking about how to better merchandise for this evolving shopper, how to deal with them, definitely follow what folks like Nick are doing. So that's it for this episode of Shopper Matters. Please subscribe, share, and connect with us, whether that's on LinkedIn or other podcast platforms, and keep the conversation going. So until next time, cheers.
Thank you, Michael.